The year is 1904. The centuries-old Chinese-Manchurian Empire is in decline, and crows circle to feast on the corpse. Russia and Japan are competing for influence in Manchuria, in the northeast of China. The Russians are moving south based out of their holdings in Siberia, and have built the ice-free Port Arthur on the Sea of Japan, while dominating the main railroad running through the region. The Japanese, a new power who recently industrialized, have already conquered Korea, and are looking even further eastwards. The two powers are about to come into conflict in one of the decisive wars of history, the Russo-Japanese War. In our timeline, Imperial Japan crushed the Russian forces and drove the Russians back into Siberia. Russia spent most of the 20th century worrying about Europe and especially Germany, instead of involving itself in East Asia. Japan rose to even greater greatness, and was eventually only defeated by the Americans in the Second World War. However, what if that never happened? What if history had gone differently, and the Russians were the victors, not the Japanese? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? What would the world be like? That is the question of this alternate history. In this timeline, Russia wins a twofold victory. Firstly, the Russians win the massive trench battle of Mukden, which at its time was probably the largest battle in history. The Russians actually outnumbered the Japanese here by 80,000 men, so this might be expected. The second victory is the naval battle of Tsushima. After the Russian Pacific Fleet was forced into hiding in Vladivostok by the Japanese, the Russians sailed their Baltic Fleet all the way through the Suez and around the Cape of Good Hope to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. After all this effort, the Japanese crushed them at the Straits of Tsushima between Korea and Japan. The Russians had twice as many battleships, but the Japanese had more and faster ships, which ended up being much more effective. I think the case for both of these battles is that they could have been won, but the Russian leadership was too ineffective to do so. In this timeline, that doesn't happen. Alexei Kuropatin and Zinovy Rostovsky are much better leaders and are able to gain victory. The Japanese land forces are decisively defeated at this timeline at Mukden. They charge the Russian trenches and in classic World War I fashion are cut down by a hail of machine gun bullets. After so many Japanese casualties, the Russians, led by the stout leadership of Alexei Kuropatin, are able to launch an effective counterattack, re-seizing some land and breaking the confidence of the Japanese army. Meanwhile, under the wise stoicism of Zinovy Rostovsky, the admiral is able to convince the Tsar to commission a few important repairs before sailing from the Baltic, and the Russian fleet is able to use its superior tactics and number of battleships to pound the Japanese fleet into Kingdom Come. Without naval support, the remaining Japanese forces in Manchuria are left unconnected to the Japanese home islands and have to give up. The resulting treaty would entirely change the balance of power in the region. Manchuria was technically part of China, so neither Japan nor Russia were technically allowed to conquer it yet. The Russians would, however, get a treaty that would give them effective control over the region. The Russians would keep their main warm-water naval port at Port Arthur on China's Liaodong Peninsula. Korea was in the process of becoming a total Japanese puppet. This would be reversed in this timeline, with the loss of the Japanese control over the seas. Korea would become a Russian client state, with Russian garrisons in the peninsula, while the Emperor of Korea would maintain control. This would have great internal effects in both nations. In our timeline, Russia almost collapsed into revolution due to the Russo-Japanese War. The Tsar was forced to liberalize the regime and add in a parliament or Duma. The seeds that led to the Russian Revolution were sown in the Russo-Japanese War. This never would have happened in this timeline. Meanwhile, Japan would experience defeat by the Russians. The Russian presence in Korea, so close to Japan, would horrify the Japanese. Japan would thus invest even more in its military to defeat the Russians in the next war. The surprising truth is that most observers in the world thought that a Russian victory in the war was a foregone conclusion. Racism was very much the dominant worldview, and with Western colonialism in full swing, the idea that a European nation could be defeated in a major war by an Asian one was seen as impossible. Tsushima cracked this bubble and helped create doubts about the strength of colonialism, ushering a paradigm shift in the way Westerners viewed the world. The different results to this war result in wildly different alliances. Across almost the entire 19th century, Britain's main rival was Russia. Russia was expanding rapidly across Asia, and the British were terrified by the idea of a Russian invasion of British India and the Middle East. Britain thus allied with France and tried its damnedest to keep Russia weak. However, after the weakness of Russia was shown in the Russo-Japanese War and Russia's eastward movement was curtailed, the British realized the main threat was Germany, an industrial behemoth that they shared the North Sea with. Thus, Britain allied with Russia against Germany. This, combined with France, created the Triple Entente alliance that was the cornerstone of World War I. This would not happen in this timeline. The British would be horrified by the results of the Russo-Japanese War. With the Korean and Manchurian ports, Russia would become a Pacific superpower. In our timeline, the British allied with the Japanese as a foil against the Russians. This would be even more true in this timeline, with the British sending ships and military strength to the Japanese. This would have incredible results later in history. When World War I would break out, Japan would ally with the Central Powers, trying to get back at Russia. Britain, seeing the Germans and Russians, their two greatest fears, killing each other, would keep out of the war. This would inevitably result in a Central Powers victory. France, without the British to hold their left flank, would collapse in 1916. Russia would be forced to fight a two-front war with Germany in the west and Japan in the east. Russia would be forced to deed the lands in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and deed Manchuria and Korea to the Japanese. Since the war would end so much earlier, the war would not be painful and long enough to see the communist revolution. Also, the seditious communist elements would not have had the initial impetus from the troubles of 1904. The communist rise to power was based incredibly upon the exact timing of the war and Lenin's arrival. Lenin's ability to feel the general zeitgeist and figure out when to have the communist revolution based upon the grumbling in St. Petersburg and lack of food, etc., was truly brilliant. Kerensky, meanwhile, would hold together the remnants of Russia together in a constitutional monarchy from the February Revolution, which would still happen. Meanwhile, winning the war would mean the Central Powers like Austro-Hungary and the Ottomans would survive. After a civil war between the Hungarian and non-Hungarian parts of the empire, Austro-Hungary would reform as a federation of ethnic groups. The Ottomans would modernize into the Young Turks, and with the discovery of oil underneath much of their empire, would become a fabulously wealthy nation. As the 1930s would roll along, we would see a very different world. Russia would turn more and more to the right. Before World War I in our timeline, Slavic nationalism was really taking off in Russia. If Russia remained a conservative democratic state, this ideology would hold more and more of a sway. All the nations that lost World War I in our timeline fell into totalitarianism. World War I would be shorter and thus less bloody in this timeline, however. I would not be surprised if this Slavic nationalism would thus turn into fascism in Russia, and if France would also collapse into fascism. Meanwhile, without the shame of having lost the war, Germany would remain under the Kaiser, and Hitler would have never risen to power. The effect upon Britain would be enormous. Before World War I, Britain was the preeminent world power. However, it quickly became apparent that Britain did not have the size to fight total war against nations like Germany or Russia alone. Britain had the flower of its youth killed in the battlefields of Flanders. Britain turned from the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor. The British Empire started to fall into irreparable decline. This would never happen in this timeline. The Empire would maintain its dominance for longer. Also, with Britain out of the war, there would be no submarine campaign that would drag its cousin, America, into the war. This would mean that the rise of American power after World War I would never happen. Without communism, Russia would become a much larger and wealthier economy. Before World War I, Russia was industrializing rapidly. The communists continued this, but they force-marched industry forward at the expense of literally everything else. The killing of the kulaks really destroyed the agricultural and entrepreneurial base of the nation. Thus, the Russian nation left the Soviet Union with a shell of an economy. That would not happen in this timeline. Russia would continually expand its economy, moving towards First World status. World War II would be dragged out of the ashes of the First World War. The French and Russians would be bitter from the loss of the war, and so a conflict over Europe would brew from this. Britain, worried that Germany would become the dominant European power and thus threaten Britain, would side with these two nations. Japan, in control over Manchuria and Korea, has two choices ahead of it: to attack the Soviet Union in the north, or attack towards Southeast Asia in the south. Japan would again side with Germany. We would actually see a war like World War II in our timeline, with Russia, Britain, and France against Germany and Japan. It's frankly hard to see who would win. The Central Powers bloc would be hard to defeat because it would be simply so massive. Having the Germans not be genocidal maniacs would also help a great deal. On the other side, Russia would continue industrialization, and Britain would still be a great power. A huge amount depends on whether or not the United States, the world's largest industrial and economic superpower, gets involved on the Allies' side. In the end, I simply can't say, and so I'll stop this alternate history here. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, support me on Patreon, and stay tuned for future content. Thank you very much.